Hey, welcome everyone to ConnectedLearning.tv. I'm Jeff Brazil, and I'm part of the team here at ConnectedLearning.tv and with the Digital Media and Learning Research Hub based in Southern California. This is our 49th webinar in a weekly series that started last March, so we're coming up on a year. And I have to say we've enjoyed taking the time this last year to collectively think about a lot of challenging questions and share some great stories about what's possible when it comes to reimagining learning in a networked age. Just a few quick details before we dive in. To those who are joining us on live stream, we encourage you to use the chat stream to introduce yourselves and connect with one another, share resources, and ask questions for those of us who are in the Google Plus Hangout. And speaking of Google Plus, we have a brand new connected learning community that currently has over 600 members just in the last few weeks. And we'd love for you to take a look at that, and if the conversations look interesting to you, to consider being a part of that community as well. And the link for that should be in the live stream chat by now. And then finally, the URL for our public group notes Google Doc should also be in the live stream chat. And that's a document that lives with this archived session long afterwards and has a lot of really great resources and links and questions and ideas in it. And we very much appreciate you helping us sort of capture highlights and quotations and ideas and thoughts, and help us share resources as well as things and ideas and links and websites come to you. So the topic today is, as the internet shifts our definition of civic engagement, how can we help citizens, especially young people, navigate new civics? And before our guest speaker, Ethan Zuckerman, begins helping us sort of frame today's conversation, I wanted to give the folks in the Hangout here a chance to introduce themselves and also just sort of talk for a second or two about their connection to this topic. So let's start with you, Justin, and then Leanna.
Hi, so my name is Justin Reich. I'm the Director of Online Community Practice and Research at Facing History and Ourselves, which is an organization that's devoted to combating bigotry and nurturing democracy through education. I'm also a fellow at the Berkman Center for Internet and Society at Harvard. I'm also formerly a history teacher, teaching world history to freshmen and electives like the modern Middle East and comparative religions to seniors in high school. So a former teacher, now working on the sort of publication, professional development, and research side.
Thanks, Justin. Leanna?
Hi, I'm Leanna Gamber-Thompson, and I'm a postdoc here at the University of Southern California working with Professor Henry Jenkins on the Media, Activism, and Participatory Politics Research Project. And I've most recently been studying libertarian youth, and I'm really interested in new forms of civic engagement, so I'm excited to be part of the conversation today.
Thanks, Leanna. I'm excited too. I really appreciate whenever I get a chance to hear from Ethan Zuckerman, and that's who's with us today. And Ethan is the director of the Center for Civic Media at MIT. He's a principal research scientist at MIT's Media Lab, and he's also going to be the keynote speaker for the 2013 Digital Media and Learning Conference, which is coming up in just a couple weeks in Chicago. And so, Ethan, if you could sort of start us off today on this topic of new civics and sort of how the internet and the network age is affecting how people, but especially young people, are able to engage civically.
Sure. Well, thanks so much. It's always a pleasure to be with you guys, and I really appreciate Justin and Leanna, you guys being here to have a conversation about this. And let me also say, you know, this is me sort of trying out some very new ideas for me, heading into the DML conversation and some things that I've been writing and blogging about. I'm a big believer in sort of trying these ideas out in public, so that when you're dumb and when you get them wrong, people tell you that you're dumb and that you get them wrong. And I hope I will get email and feedback from you guys telling me that I'm dumb, that I'm getting it wrong. Look, for me, this sort of starts with the question of how we deal with the word civics. I took over the center sponsored by the Knight Foundation called the Center for Civic Media. And one of the things that I realized very early on is that civics as a term is one that people hate. It sort of immediately puts people in the 1950s. You know, even for people of my generation, it takes us to Schoolhouse Rock, and I'm just a bill, I'm only a bill. There's this sort of sense of there's a system that we should have learned about, we should understand it a little bit better than we do, and there's all sorts of responsibilities that we should be taking on, but there seems to be little space for creativity, little space for expression, and that seems so far removed from what I see in activist spaces, in social change spaces, in media production spaces, that it seems like the space of civics just needs a fairly thorough rethink or a rebranding of sorts. So where I find myself sort of starting on this is there's a huge amount of dialogue around the idea of a crisis in civics. And you'll see this from very, very smart people like former Justice Sandra Day O'Connor. You'll also see this on both sides of the political aisle, and you'll see people complaining about lack of civic engagement, lack of political knowledge. It's become a trope on the right as far as sort of ignorance of political systems. It's become a trope on the left with people like Bob Putnam and sort of lack of citizen engagement or civic engagement. And there's a lot of different ways we can measure this. We can look at voting participation. We can look at how often people are participating in political dialogues. And it turns out that the metrics are pretty inconclusive. You can make a case that these metrics are not as high as we would like, but it's actually very hard to make a case that we're on some sort of giant historic slide. It actually turns out that people have been complaining about people's civic disengagement and ignorance, sort of back into the ancient Greeks. And that, it's mostly a change in who we expect to be involved with these discussions that happens at different times. So I want to think about how you bridge a little bit from this question of civics in crisis to some of the really interesting energetic movements we're seeing, particularly of youth getting involved with public participation, getting involved with civic change. And I'll just throw out a couple of different spaces that I think are interesting in one direction or another. One of the most conventional might be a movement like Dream Activists, where you have youth really demanding citizenship rights, going after fairly straightforward legislative processes, saying, look, we need legislation on a federal level to make this possible, to make change possible. We need to find a way to sort of raise our voices. And so we're going to use a combination of legislative means and media means to be engaged in an issue that we're deeply concerned with and that has real resonance for us as young people. We could also look at sort of organized activities like something like the Harry Potter Alliance, which I know is something that Henry Jenkins has been studying at USC. We spend a lot of time with Andrew Slack, who organizes that group here in Boston. And here's a group that basically says, we're not political, but we do identify ourselves as change agents. And this is something that I see a lot in the civic space, or people explicitly saying, I don't want to be involved with politics. That's not how I identify myself. But I do want to be involved with social change in one fashion or another. And here, let's be united by our common passion for a set of texts, by a common fandom. And let's think about the values that come out of that community. Can we channel that into a specific form of change? And that change, in many cases, has involved boycotts and sort of corporate activism, going after some of the people who've been involved with the Harry Potter movies and trying to get them to make more responsible decisions about fair trade, about the products that they're using, and all of this. Very different form of civics, very different form of engagement, very different levers of change, but also very absorbing and very participatory. I'll throw out a third one, which is very controversial, but is one that we've spent a decent amount of time studying here, which is anonymous and denial of service attacks. So what we think we know about the anonymous community is that it's fairly large, fairly diverse, but at its heart, there's a lot of young people who are computer savvy to varying degrees, not all of them, but very much see technology as a space for change and are involved with a project that very much started as for the lulz, really just how can we make fun of people, how can we sort of have fun, but now has taken on a really deep interest in different aspects of social engagement, sometimes US-based, sometimes international, and these surprisingly insightful conversations that people end up having online. What could we do to support the Arab Spring in Egypt? Now, there's a tendency for these conversations to end up with the same hammer hitting the same nails. Here's Egypt, they're trying to black out the internet. Why don't we DDoS the last remaining internet service provider? Because we're very good at doing denial of service. Not necessarily the most helpful way to go in this, but another case of people sort of saying, we want to figure out how to have some sort of social impact. The way that we know to have social impact is to discuss online and to try to figure out how to use technology to have impact on the world. Is there a way that we come up with a definition of civics that's broad enough to include not just sort of learning branches of government, separations of powers, how that works, but thinking about media-driven activism, thinking about consumer activism, thinking about hacktivism, thinking about all these different examples of ways of being engaged in civics. And so the last thing that I want to sort of throw out as a way that I'm starting to think about this, I'm starting to think kind of in two different directions on things. And the first I'll just mention in passing, I don't want to get hugely into it, although I'll get into it more deeply in DML, which is I'm very interested in the different levers of change that we think are possible as civic actors. I think when we've taught civics in the schools, we've assumed that change happens through legislation and occasionally through the courts. And I think as someone who does an enormous amount of work in the human rights community, that community tends to focus on how do we pass good laws and how do we fight laws in court. And there's obviously an enormous amount of work, an enormous amount to be known in that space, but the legal system and the court system is not the only possible lever for change. There's the possibility of influencing corporations. There's the possibility of trying to change opinion at scale through using media and trying to have some form of cultural change. There's the possibility of people self-organizing to conduct change in their communities and put projects together to address problems that they're trying to build on a local scale and potentially build up to larger and larger scales. And one of the theories that I would offer in this is that I think in many cases, young people either find these legislative-based theories of change very inaccessible, very hard to sort of believe that that's where they're going to have an impact, and particularly sort of media and cultural theories of change, a much easier place to get in and potentially have an impact. So that then leads to the next question that I want to ask, which is I'm starting to think about this question of civics in terms of a pretty simple 2x2 matrix. And the two axes that I want to put on the matrix, one is thick versus thin, and I'll define that in a moment. And the other is effective, effective versus symbolic, perhaps we'll call it. So the critique that's come up, and I think it's a very worthwhile critique of some forms of online civic engagement, is that they're slacktivism or clicktivism. So I think to Evgeny Morozov, who's been very passionate about this, I think to some of the other thinkers in the space who've offered these critiques. And the critique is basically signing an online petition, liking something on Facebook, is a very thin level of commitment, and it's also ineffectual. It's very hard to sort of see how that leads to change in the long run. And so when we end up sort of defending these sorts of activities, we end up talking about ladders of engagement. We have to start there, and then we find ways to bring people up into stuff that's more impactful sort of over time. And I wonder if the answer is instead, let's think through this as a matrix. There are things that we are told are very impactful, like voting, that are also pretty thin in terms of what we're actually asking people to do. If we sort of say bad activism is liking this on Facebook, but good civic engagement is voting in an election. I got to tell you, I live in the state of Massachusetts. I'm never going to sway an election in my entire life. It's simply not going to happen. My marginal vote in my deep blue state is very unlikely to have a piece of it. And it's certainly possible to vote in an extremely thin way, where it's a fairly simple action that you're taking every 2 to 4 years. And even in the comment there with the Scott Brown Senate election, I'm going to tell you, no, I don't think so. Like, I don't think that was especially close. I think Scott Brown was a bit of an anomaly when he first came around. But I'm going to argue that in many cases, voting could actually be a fairly thin, if we think impactful, form of civic activity. So on the thin side, what I mean by thin action is it's easy for you to do, it's been clearly defined, it doesn't require a lot of strategy or creativity on your part, it's your participation within an existing system. And I'm going to oppose that to the notion of thick engagement. And thick engagement is sort of getting involved with something over a very long period of time, learning more about it. As your path up the ladder of engagement increases, your path of depth of knowledge and depth of nuance increases. And it's playing on your ability as a creative actor to build your own content, to build your own paths towards persuasion, to figure out how you want to try to build a movement. And so something like dream activism, to me, goes very much on the thick side of things quite quickly. When you have youth essentially saying, I'm interested in producing videos, I want to come out as a dream activist, I want to come out as undocumented, I want to figure out how I'm going to organize and how I'm going to be part of this movement. To me, that seems like a thicker, more involved, more engaged piece of it. But then we have questions about the efficacy side of it. Is that purely a symbolic act, or do we see efficacy in, over time, is that moving one of these levers that we care about? And what I want to suggest is that I think the collectivism critique is pretty appropriate in that there are ways of being civically engaged that are thin and ineffectual. There are ways of being civically engaged that are thin and effectual. And, I think voting, often is. It's not necessarily a particular deep, involved, creative thing to do. It's participation within a system. And if you live in Ohio, it's likely to have very real impact. And I'm mostly joking. I am a devoted voter in Massachusetts, even if we see it as a fairly thin form of engagement. But I think in many ways, what we're really hoping for is stuff that's both thick and impactful. So how do we get people involved in civics in a way that is leaning on their creativity, is having people understand issues in a deep and nuanced way, that is encouraging people to design their own interventions and design their ways to go on things. But I think we're also trying to be very cognizant of the idea that the missing corner of that matrix is thick but not impactful. And that there's lots of things we could do that involve creating content, that involve being very creative, very original, but are poorly harnessed to different levers of change. And if we're poorly harnessed to those levers of change, it may be very eye-catching, it may be very entertaining, it may be very rewarding for the people who are doing it, but at the end of the day, it may not move us towards any particular form of social change in a deep sense. So I'm interested in, can we optimize for that thick and effective part of the matrix, and can we start thinking about how we educate people to both take advantage of that creativity, that ability to produce media, that ability to engage, that ability to sort of dive deep into sort of understanding where issues are coming from, but also think about those questions at the end of the day of efficacy. Who are you influencing? How is that leading to change? Where is it going?
Thanks, Ethan. There's a lot to think about there, and I'm looking at a couple of comments already. So Justin and Leanna, before we go to some questions that are coming in, I wanted to give you guys a chance to respond to what Ethan just sort of laid out there.
Okay, I actually just wanted to ask if you could give a couple of examples of the thick but not impactful, because I think that's the one that's maybe the hardest for me to wrap my head around. And I was thinking, maybe does Coney 2012 fall in that category, or sort of what are recent events that you might think would fit in there?
So Coney 2012 is really interesting. I think depending on which piece of it you want to take up, I'm going to argue that you could use Coney 2012 to explore at least 3 corners of the matrix, right? So there's the thin and not very impactful, which is, hey, let's share this video, let's get this up to 100 million views. That doesn't require an enormous amount of creativity or involvement on your part. So that in that sense, it's fairly thin. And given at the end of the day, we haven't seen some of the outcomes that Coney is looking for, you could make the argument that it's not very impactful. I would say that for people who've become very involved with invisible children, their involvement in many cases is quite thick. And for people who are engaged within that movement, who sort of use the intro to climb a ladder of engagement and who are trying to figure out what's a strategy in their community, I think that could be very thick engagement. I think it could also in some cases be sort of low impact. The flip side I would say on this is I had one of the organizers of the Resolve to MIT last summer to talk about Kony 2012. And he actually gave a fairly convincing case that Invisible Children and Kony 2012 did exactly what it was supposed to do. And it was just that most of it didn't understand what it was supposed to do. What it was supposed to do was demonstrate in Congress that going after Joseph Kony had a constituency. And so it would get very, very difficult to do things like remove troops from Uganda or shake U.S. support for Yoweri Museveni, and that it did that in spades. And that as much as we can sit here and sort of say a year later, no one's arrested Joseph Kony, you know, I guess that warrant is up, that maybe we're not taking seriously enough where they actually wanted to have impact. Now, in that sense, you could argue that it was thin but impactful in that a whole lot of people were involved with it, and in demonstrating the fact that there were tens of millions of American youth for who this was an issue, it ended up having an impact. But to make that one make sense, you have to hide the ball a little bit. What I would say as far as thick and not impactful, I think we got to ask real hard questions about the Occupy movement. That was incredibly thick involvement for people who put their deep time and effort into being in those camps, who've worked very, very hard on thinking about how you organize political movements in different ways, who've built and created media. I'm not convinced at the end of the day that Occupy really moved the needle radically on how we talk about inequality. And in fact, some of the research that we're doing here at Civic Media is just trying to figure out, can we measure that sort of impact? But I think we have to entertain, at least as a hypothesis, that that was a very thick form of engagement, but may not have been a high impact form of engagement, perhaps in part because the levers of change that it chose to operate on and the ones that it chose to ignore. That was a movement that tried very, very hard to sort of say, we're not going to make specific legislative demands, we reject that system, chose a very tricky lever of change, which was sort of the do-it-yourself, transform communities through a particular type of leadership. I look at a sympathetic critic of the movement like Quinn Norton, who basically says, you know, look, I went to a lot of GAs. You don't want to run the world via a General Assembly. And that, to me, points to the very real problem of thick but low impact. So I think at least we have to entertain it, although I want to approach that sort of as an open research question.
Justin, do you have a comment on sort of Ethan's this sort of opening idea about this matrix and how that would work and how we evaluate different engagements and actions based on those?
Yeah, I think the idea of thick and thin is very helpful. I mean, I think one of the things that complicates the new media world is that it seems to be easier and easier to have lots of thin actions compile to be really impactful kinds of things. And you know, I mean, that's sort of the power of voting, is that it's a simple and symbolic act in countries with free elections. It's not a thin action in newly established democracies. So all these things are kind of contextual. If you can be killed for voting, then voting is not a thin act. But to me, it's that question of scale which I think opens up, you know, that to me is what new media sort of opens up the most kind of interesting domains about. Like when I was listening to Ethan talk about different ways of being political, I feel like that's a conversation that's been sort of well established in the people who are interested in civics for a long time. For me, it sort of resonates with kind of the phrase "the personal is political" coming out of feminism in the 60s and the 70s. Like I think of people like midwives, who I think about a lot because I have a 2-year-old and my cohort is having a lot of babies. And to me, interacting with midwives is interacting with intensely political people who have decided to channel their political energies into having women, take power over their bodies and take power over the experience of giving birth in a way that sort of resonates with, that makes, reminds me of my sort of 60s era mother and some of her political convictions. And so I don't think, I think there are new ways in which the digital sort of makes it possible to take the political into new domains, but I think that's a thread that's really long. I think it's this, to me, it's sort of the question of scale that makes some of this more interesting, that a midwife over the course of her whole life is going to interact with, thousands of women or something like that in a long career, but not tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of women. Whereas I'm thinking of, say, Katie Butler, the 15-year-old girl who started the petition to have the bully documentary represented as, or made PG-13 instead of R. Here's a 15-year-old girl in the middle of Michigan who starts a petition, and obviously she's got a lot of, different kinds of corporate interests and other stuff supporting that. But at the same time, like, one girl, makes an online petition and hundreds of thousands of people participate that in these kind of thin actions. And so it's this question, scale is another one of these dimensions that I think is, compelling to think about in terms of, what does the digital bring that really changes the nature of these conversations? And, and I think, as Ethan has done really well, is to say that there's a lot of stuff that the digital doesn't change about these conversations that go back really deeply.
Yeah, my mind, piggybacking off of your point, Justin, I'm thinking of a 13-year-old boy in New York City who launched a campaign, an online campaign, to save a newspaper vendor who'd been there for 25 years that the city was trying to shut down. Ultimately, it wasn't successful, but he was changed by the experience of how people interacted with his petition and his ideas and his photography. And then I think about the other example that's always tossed out, which is the Change.org petition that got rid of the $5 banking fee. So it was successful, but to what end, right?
So, so one of the things about wrestling with this idea is that you keep sort of refining it over time, and this is the fun of sort of putting it out there. And one of the things that I'm sort of realizing in all of this is that thin versus thick can sound very judgmental. And so let me speak in defense of thin for a moment here. We just had a conversation preceding the TED conference, and this I hadn't realized at the time was the predecessor to Knight announcing that they were giving a large grant to TED, but this was a conversation between some of the people on the editorial side of TED and some people who are involved in civic change in the US about how TED could think about having impact. And the question that was put on the table was, we have these TED Talks. At best, they get watched by tens of millions of people. Many of them are talks interested in social change in one fashion or another. What if we started asking TED speakers to suggest the 3 things that they want people to do? And this very rapidly turned into people in the group saying, well, that's great. I mean, definitely do ask the TED speakers, but also ask your community to suggest the things that you want to do. And when you do this, you really have to think about a wide range of options. There's that moment where someone encounters a video that was really important to them. They really want something to do right then. And that probably has to be a fairly simple, carefully defined, participatory activity that lets you sort of take that moment of interest and that moment of passion and sort of try to figure out how to run with it. And it's possible that that then does take us up the ladder of engagement theory, and maybe you'll get involved with something. But it's kind of a disaster if everyone who watches Al Gore's talk decides to start their own deeply engaged environmental movement, right? Like, that actually probably doesn't get us anywhere. Whereas, maybe it is actually very helpful if 100,000 people who watch it find something that's fairly easy to do fairly quickly, and then maybe some of them go on, whether they buy a Prius or whether they do whatever is a deeper form of engagement in all of this. So I think stuff that's thin, impactful, and takes advantage of scale, which Justin was just pointing out is a critical piece of it, I think that's a wonderful way to think about it. And I think one of the reasons that we're having this conversation at this moment in time is that the internet and social media has really changed how we think about scale. Historically, it's been awfully hard for one person to think about how they impact, more than a couple hundred people. If your social circle is Dunbar's number or somewhere around there, your hope for change is either influence those 200 odd folks around you or try to figure out how to hit a broadcast medium. Now, it's not unrealistic for people to sort of say, I'm going to find a way to influence 1,000, 10,000, 100,000 people along the lines of some of the examples that you guys just gave there. But it is very hard to sort of figure out how you design it so that it allows everyone to participate and has that sort of impact at scale. And I think that's where I'm talking about how do you harness these efforts to levers that actually persuade someone who's in a position of power. And that can be very tricky. Let me just say a word on the midwives. I think a lot of what I'm interested in this space is trying to figure out how we broaden our definition of civics so that something like choosing midwifery as a career and committing over the course of 20, 30, 40 years to change how we think about childbirth, how we think about women's health. I think that's an incredibly deeply civically engaged activity, and I would love to find a way to figure out how do we take that as seriously as part of civics as we take someone running a political campaign. It's very different. It works on a very different scale. It works in a way that basically sort of forces us to think about how do we make a change in that immediate community, and then also how do we have this sort of sharing aspect of it as sort of saying, here's what I'm doing, here's why I'm doing it, let me try to influence others in the course of doing it. But I think that's a very rich space of exploration, and part of what I'm trying to do, I think we've gone through this interesting period of time where we've taken politics very seriously and civics not very seriously. And I think this odd phenomenon where you ask someone and you sort of say, oh, are you an activist? And they go, no, 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 of course not. That's not what I do. But instead, they want to be seen as doing something else. I think in some ways that's sort of a sense that getting involved with politics has become this very particular profession, this very esoteric field of knowledge, and that there's a whole bunch of other forms of civic engagement that we need to try to find a way to elevate and sort of take as seriously, both in terms of celebrating them, but also thinking about those questions of how we measure impact over time.
Ethan, one of the questions that's come in from the live stream is, what do you feel is the difference between civic involvement versus civic engagement?
So that's an interesting question, and language is important on all of these things. And like I said, I'm trying to answer a lot of these questions. I think engagement is really a question of sort of how do you reach out to a population, and how do you sort of make it possible for others to come and sort of join in with you. I think involvement is sort of more the question of where do you find yourself involved. And I think one of the tricks on this question of civics is, again, civics and guilt sort of come together in some interesting ways. I know that I feel guilty about what issues I'm not involved with. I am not as involved with local politics in Western Massachusetts as I would really like to be in the community where I live. But I'm deeply, deeply involved in a lot of debates around international aid. And so my involvement has taken a very particular mix of what global issues I'm involved with, what national, what local. And I think everyone has their own sort of profile of involvement. I think engagement probably comes down to when you're a group, when you're an institution, essentially saying, who's involved with my particular entity? So I think that question of engagement is something that I would be thinking about if I'm the city of Boston and I'm sort of saying, geez, people are really disconnected from me. They don't understand what we do in the government. How do we try to figure out how do we change the engagement so that one's involvement profile is different within that? But you know, I suspect the question comes from the fact that I'm probably using the terms interchangeably, and I certainly shouldn't be. So I appreciate the question on sharpening language.
It's a good prompt. So we have many teachers and educators that are sort of paying attention to some of these ideas, and the webinars they're a big part of the webinar participation. So let's kind of shift to how you teach and prepare young people for the opportunities that we talked about, but also some of the challenges. And as I asked that question, building off your earlier point, Ethan, about how never before have you sort of had this ability to express yourself and to have voice, not only as an individual, but I would even say as from an age standpoint. I'm thinking about how young people are able to have voice and self-expression in a way that was not possible before. There's that young girl in the UK who started taking pictures of the lunches they were serving in her school, exposing, the kind of nutrition issues, and ended up becoming a global audience. So it's not just an individual, but also just that young people can. So how do teachers sort of help kids get their arms around the opportunities, but also some of the challenges?
Well, let me first actually push back a little bit on you, because a friend and colleague of mine, Jennifer Light, has been doing a bunch of research on youth civics participation at a much earlier moment in time. And so she was particularly interested in sort of pre-World War I America. And it turns out that there were this amazing sort of set of youth institutions designed to train youth, particularly youth at risk, in sort of participation in systems of government. So you would have these governance systems and court systems and newspapers sort of set up of teenage boys as a way to sort of try to figure out how to train them to be citizens. So it was a very particular form of civic engagement. It was a very weird moment in time. But I think this notion that youth are unengaged with this until they hit college or maybe post-college actually is a fairly recent and contemporary malady. And I think it's a good thing that we're sort of trying to figure out how we get over that and sort of how we get past that. As far as how we think about teaching this, I would say of the people who've sort of been researching civics education, the one common ground that I can find on this is that nobody thinks that educating on civics in the classroom is a good idea, period. That near as we can tell, the notion of having a class on civics appears to be the least successful conceivable thing you could do to teach civics. You do much better teaching civics in the context of other classes, whether it's teaching history, whether it's teaching English, that one way or another, people seem to do much better bringing up these concepts in the course of other discussions. I think the second thing that's sort of come into play as far as literature on this is that participation matters immensely, and that service learning around this seems to be stronger than classroom teaching around this, although it's possible to do service learning better or worse around this. And for me, it seems like probably the likely way to go after this is that this is a place where what we know about interest-driven learning is probably very important, and that looking for what people are passionate about and then trying to figure out how that becomes a teachable moment around a whole variety of different issues is one possible way to look at this. So if I were sort of designing curriculum around this, I would be looking for issues that students are already passionate about. I would then be looking for ways to try to help students think about how you deepen your knowledge on an issue, how you do really deep reading on an issue and start understanding reading in context, start understanding how you're making truth claims in media, start understanding different entities within media, and how to sort of triangulate, I think, some of the media literacy and digital media literacy stuff that we care about. And then I think thinking through possible interventions, and ideally not just thinking about how do we take action on this, but how do we figure out who we're trying to influence and how do we measure who we've tried to influence over time. That's all really tough to pack into a lesson plan. And I think any lesson plan that sort of starts with figure out what your kids are interested and passionate about and sort of goes from there, it is perhaps an unhelpful pedagogical suggestion. It's got a high degree of risk to it. At the same time, I think that's likely where the people who have really deep learning about this sort of get that deep learning. This is really an area where experimentation and practice seems to be a very important piece of things.
Justin, you got a comment here?
Sure. I think I think a lot of what Ethan said is just right. I mean, I think as we think about sort of how you do this for educators, it's definitely challenging to think about how do you work with young children, teenage children in such a way that encourages them to be engaging in campaigns? How do you, if you want to do this at the class level, how do you get 30 students to agree on a do you want to have 30 students agree on a particular issue and then work towards that issue? Do you want to have multiple campaigns of people who are opposing each other within the class because people have a range of opinions? The practicalities of these things are pretty challenging, but they're done successfully places. Actually, there's a woman named Angela Myers who I think has made arguments for a while that actually it's much more important that they find something to be passionate about, that they get something to be passionate about than they discover it themselves. So that actually educators who can bring in externally things that are worth being passionate about can be as compelling as students discovering it on their own. The other sort of teaching strategy that I think is really compelling borrows on Ethan's idea of looking to multiple subjects, and I think history is incredibly helpful here, particularly getting people to understand the historical examples of people who have made change, and making sure that our historical examples of people who have made change include not just unapproachable heroic figures, but more ordinary, relatable figures. So Mira Levinson in her work talks about the difference between heroes and role models, and thinking about how a history class might include fewer heroes and more role models. At Facing History and Ourselves, one of the things that we've spent a lot of time on in our work with people is having them have deep exploration of the choices that people made in terrible historical periods like the Holocaust and the Civil Rights Movement. But helping students recognize that the way that history unfolds, it unfolds because individuals made choices, and sometimes those choices had tragic consequences, and sometimes those choices had remarkable and heroic consequences. But people all the time are making choices about how they treat their neighbors and how they stand up for people, and what they choose to sit by and watch happen, whether that plagues us with guilt or not. And those choices create the world that we live in. That the world we live in looks to young people like it's fixed, like it has to be that way. When you study history from the perspective that people made choices and those choices change the scope of history, it suggests to young people that they had too have the capacity to change the scope of history. And then the really challenging part that I think educators face now is that people who are my age can look back and say, well, this historically is how people have made change. This historically is how people have gone on that pathway from symbolic to effective that Ethan mapped out. The harder thing for contemporary educators to do is to say, okay, what does the pathway from symbolic to effective look like right now with all the new tools that we have available to us, with the way that the internet creates a global commons? What are new forms of activism that can make a difference in the world? Sometimes it doesn't even matter sort of what it is, what kind of activism you're looking at, but just helping young people see examples of people who made changes that they care about, whether it's, the examples of young libertarians or the example of the Harry Potter Alliance. What does that look like in the contemporary world?
So let me just react quickly to sort of two pieces of that. I mean, I think the first is that whenever you're teaching history from the perspective of agency, you're teaching civics, right? Because civics is basically, it's about agency. It's about essentially saying, whether it's an open or a closed society, you have the possibility of either sitting on the sidelines or participating in one fashion or another. In very conventional ways of teaching civics, where we've sort of said, okay, here are the rules of the game, here's your space for input, here's how you vote, here's how you design legislation, so on and so forth. We're teaching one form of engagement, but we could be teaching other forms of engagement. But at the heart of all of this is the sense that there's agency involved throughout. And I think trying to figure out how to look at moments of history and sort of saying, what was the agency of different people involved? Also, what are the constraints on that agency? I mean, it's very hard to talk about moments in time when people are under immense stress and immense pressure and what decisions you could or couldn't make. But I think that's the hook that sort of brings us into civic practice. I think that observation that, we can look in retrospect and say, the Rosa Parks bus boycott worked for the following reasons, and here are the forces that we did. And, not only do we worry about the heroism of it, and we can talk about, whether Rosa Parks is a uniquely heroic figure or whether it's sort of a movement that's the hero at that point. But in many ways, we're sort of then looking at what the levers of change were at the time. And I think in many ways, but a lot of my criticism about the human rights field and much of the social change field in the US is that I think in many ways we're still learning from the lessons that we got in the U.S. Civil Rights Movement, and that we actually haven't swung around to thinking about media as a tool for change, cultural change at scale, really distributed sort of do-it-yourself community change, and really found ways to take that all seriously enough. One of the questions that was sort of asked in all of this was what sort of infrastructures exist to help us do this, and I think my response to that would be to say, I'm less worried about what the infrastructures are. I'm actually much worried in trying to figure out these questions of efficacy. And I think this is something that almost all of us who are involved with social change don't take seriously enough. You know, we all want to engage in one form of change or another. So my campaign on social change for the last 8 years has been, I'm trying to get Americans to think of themselves as global citizens. I'm trying to get them to pay more attention to the rest of the world. I'm trying to get more nuanced debate. I'm trying to get more perspectives into media. I'm trying to get people to see things from a global stance as well as a local stance, because I think on a lot of the issues that we care about, it has everything to do with what solutions you bring to the table. When I look at a movement like Global Voices, I have very complicated feelings about our efficacy. And I can sort of point to things where I feel like we've been enormously effective. I can point to things where I feel like we've been much less effective. But I think all of us who are sort of engaged in change have to start getting much more serious about how we think about efficacy and really asking ourselves hard questions, not just about our own movements, but about what we want to teach people when we teach them how to sort of seek change in the world.
Leanne, I think you had a question you wanted to ask.
Yeah, I wanted to ask Ethan what he thinks, what role educators might have in encouraging students to engage with electoral politics. And I'm kind of thinking about my own research on libertarians. One interesting finding that was quite unexpected, actually, was that the majority of the folks that I interviewed were sort of considered themselves to be categorical non-voters, and they talked about wanting to create social change in the discursive sphere rather than in the electoral sphere, because they're just sort of fed up with politics. And I'm also connecting that to what you said earlier about perhaps thinking about the impact or lack thereof of Occupy because they sort of skirted around legislative issues. And so and I think it might be secretly the dutiful citizen in me coming out, but it's like a little bit, it makes me a little bit nervous when we think about efficacy and when we think about impact, to sort of try to figure out where we have a role in encouraging voting or encouraging participating in electoral politics versus sort of the more community service model that I think is often more encouraged in schools these days, whether it's for credit or getting engaged in these different activities. So I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And first of all, let me say, really helpful for me to hear that in your research you're seeing non-voting out of libertarians, and I find that fascinating. Now that I think about it, I don't actually find it all that surprising. If you find yourself sort of looking at this and saying, what I desperately want is a third way of doing this, trying to figure out how to vote for one of two ways that you think is not a particularly good way of doing it, seems like a really false choice and like a move purely into the symbolic space and sort of out of the efficacy space. Let me say that I cannot commend enough as a provocation an essay from my friend Quinn Norden titled "Don't Vote." And this was her explanation as a journalist who identifies with the Occupy movement, as someone who I think would be okay with being identified as being part of the fairly radical left, in sort of saying, look, I get it, you know, my grandmother fought for the right to vote. I think there were moments of time in which this would have been the thing to do. Here is why I'm choosing not to vote, and here's why I think that's actually the effective decision at that moment in time. But the reason that I'm putting on this question of symbolism versus efficacy, and the reason that I'm trying to add that into the sort of two-dimensional matrix, is that, oh man, I'm with you. I'm trying to figure out how do we deal with this moment in time where a lot of movements that have gotten a lot of attention and a lot of participation are so frustrated with a political system that they're basically opting out of it. So I often use in my talks a slide where I'll put up the logo of the Tea Party movement, of Occupy, of Anonymous, and of WikiLeaks, and sort of saying if you were going to draw a thread between these movements, the common thread is that they basically don't believe that participation in the political process as we know it is worth your time. The Tea Party's version of participation is basically to try to throw enough sand in the gears to sort of, bring that whole electoral apparatus, just to a screeching halt. The others is either to avoid it entirely, as Occupy does, or subvert it in very interesting ways, as WikiLeaks or Anonymous are. And the fact that those have gotten so much discussion and so much attention, to me, suggests that there's a cultural moment where we're very skeptical of those sort of formal mechanisms of change. I would say that that's not surprising at a moment where you have 9% congressional approval, and people saying that they prefer cockroaches and colonoscopies to Congress in terms of if they had to make a comparison of which they think is more desirable. I would also point out that particularly for youth, we've seen the age of Congress people steadily go up, and youth stay young. And so that gap between, whether you can be involved in that space, whether those people are connected to you in a meaningful way, that keeps growing over time. So I think people are simply looking for a place where they can feel like they are personally effective. One of the things that happens in the media space is it's trackable, it's measurable. I shared this video, here's where it went. And so then the question sort of becomes, is that really bringing us to a point where we're getting effective change in one fashion or another? And that's why we have to ask that efficacy question. But I also think it's really worth asking the efficacy question in the other direction. Is your vote effective? Is a Congress that passed something like 1.5% of the bills that came to the floor in the last Congress, is that really effective? And if we were trying to teach youth this is how you get involvement and change in one fashion or another, is that the door we want them to push on, or do we want them to push on a door that swings wide and open? I think we've ended up doing this sort of community engagement because we feel like it's effective, at least on the small scale, and frankly because it's not going to get us in trouble. As educators, if we go out and sort of say, okay, our class has decided that we're going to work on gun violence this semester, and we're going to try to figure out what our response is to Sandy Hook, are you going to end up with a parent or a community member coming in and essentially saying, I cannot believe you're using public funds to attack the Second Amendment? And so we duck it. And so we go to an area where no one's going to object to us trying to work in a soup kitchen, so we'll work in the soup kitchen. Because we're scared, understandably, of moving into those deeply controversial areas. But those deeply controversial areas may be the place where people really have the passion and where we have the opportunity to see real change around.
Just a quick question, Ethan, to your point, that the earlier point about the youth disengagement is sort of a malady that's contemporary, not necessarily backed up in history. The perceptions that people have of the formal institutional system, is that new? Or is that 50, 60, 70, 80 years ago, did people have the same perception of the formal institution? Has it really changed?
So I mean, I don't know this material well enough because I'm not a historian of the period, but I think the theory at that point was youth needed to be educated in how government worked, and then they would be able to be full participants in those institutions would represent them. And I would say I see variations on that theory of change in work in movements like My Society. So in terms of the different approaches to open government, the American approach to open government for the most part has been this sort of, let's get transparency, and then we'll see all the bad stuff that people are up to, and then maybe we'll expose it, we'll bring it into the light, Sunlight Foundation, best disinfected. The UK approach has been very different. It's sort of like, you got a problem in your neighborhood, let us show you how the UK government works, let us help you figure out how to be an effective citizen. And by the way, if you get a little bit further in this, then you might figure out where the actual space for change ends up being. And I don't think it's a bad theory of change. I think, like most of them, it has some limits and it has some potentials on it. But I mean, I think where things get really questionable is if you've hit a point of mistrust in institutions where trying to get people to work within those institutions gets hard to believe. So Justin, just posted a wonderful comment in our chat here of sort of suggesting if you have a spiral where people think that politics doesn't work, and the only people who get into politics are a little crazy, then politics gets crazier and crazier and crazier sort of over time, and it gets harder and harder and harder to pull people into it. And I think we probably have been in that spiral for at least much of my adult life. I know that the students that I went to college with who got into politics were a definite personality type, and they've gone on to be real active in politics, and the politics has followed their definite personality type. And so it's possible that when you make it possible for a small number of people to opt into a particular form of engagement, you're going to self-select around a particular direction. I've been trying to figure out how to learn from some older historical models. I've been trying to learn a little bit about 3rd century BCE Athens, where it wasn't a voting democracy. It was sort of a wholly participatory democracy where people got chosen by lot to take on different civic functions. And I think that notion of sort of preparing for a moment where you might be called on to do a civic duty on a very broad scale is actually a very provocative idea to think about as we think about contemporary civics.
I could keep talking for a long time about this subject. I really appreciate the conversation. The hour's gone fast. We're up to the top of the hour, and I just wanted to give each of you guys sort of a final thought. And thinking about the audience and the people that are really interested in this material, just sort of maybe a concrete suggestion or two about a teacher or a parent or a youth who want to take advantage of this sort of new civic opportunity, what they might do. So Leanna, let's start with you first.
Sure. Okay, it's a tough question, but for me to boil it down. But I would just suggest, for teachers and parents to encourage their kids to be creative and to get involved in the interest-driven learning that Ethan mentioned earlier, around whether it's political or not. Their personal interests can be harnessed for sort of civic potential, as we see with the Harry Potter Alliance. So I think just learning those skills and encouraging creativity and encouraging kids to get involved around their interests is a good start. It might not end up sort of leading people in the pathway that towards civic engagement, but I think it's a good start.
Thanks. Justin?
So I think one of my takeaways from this conversation will be thinking about that process of how do individuals make change historically, and studying those case studies and recognizing that in the field of history and social studies we have some really well-developed historical cases, and I think there's a lot of room for teachers and curriculum developers and other people to create more cases from the last year or two, for teachers to say, okay, we've just been studying these examples of upstanders in the civil rights movement, upstanders during the Holocaust, upstanders in other time periods. What would those upstanders look like today in a world where everyone has a smartphone in their pocket and we're all connected to one another? What are the cases that we can look at now? I think teachers and students and parents would find that both a really intellectually rich exercise, and also a really fun one.
Thanks, Justin. And Ethan, you will finish us out.
Sure. Let me start by saying, once again, the reason I'm doing this is because I don't actually have very good answers to these questions. This is a set of issues that I'm fascinated by, and the reason that I'm trying to write and talk about them more than anything else is to sort of draw people out and draw them into the dialogue. And what actually makes me happiest is doing a conversation like this and getting the email in half an hour or half a week that sort of says, you're full of it, you haven't considered this piece of it, and that's usually where I learn about this stuff. It's the nice thing about professionally being an idiot and sort of iterating to the point where you know a little bit more about things. What I would say for me is that we're at a moment in time where people feel very empowered to act, at least in media spaces, and so they feel very empowered to share and spread and so on and so forth. And what I would urge for parents and educators is to sort of say that the first step on any of this is the skeptical evaluation of a claim. We had such a missed opportunity with Kony 2012. Kony 2012 was this just great opportunity to sort of do a really deep dive and sort of say, how was this message constructed? Who's benefiting from this message? What story isn't being told? How do we do the deep critical read about this? How do we try to figure out how we make sense and tell truth on the internet? And I know that some educators did this, and more power to them. But for all of us, these sort of moments of, here's a moment of passion, it's a moment to both do that really deep dive into understanding an issue before we then start climbing that ladder of engagement to doing. So I'm really interested in sort of how we move in both those directions at the same time.
Thank you all for a really interesting conversation, and Ethan for just having the spirit of just sort of let's experiment and talk and learn together. I really appreciate that.
Well, thanks so much for having us.
Thank you, guys. And so just to keep things going on the conversation today, we encourage you to use the hashtag, Twitter hashtag Connected Learning. And you can also post ideas, links, thoughts, questions in the Google Plus community for Connected Learning. And then by this afternoon, we will have a full recording of this webinar, and all of the content and stories and ideas and people that have been mentioned in our time today will be up on that page on connectedlearning.tv, and you can also post comments on that page. And then next week, connectedlearning.tv will have its final webinar leading up to the Digital Media and Learning Conference, which is taking place, I want to point out, March 14th through 16th in Chicago. This week is actually the last week to register online, and so visit dml2013.dmlhub.net for more information. And then this coming Wednesday, March 6th, from 9 to 10 a.m. Pacific time, we will be chatting with the DML 2013 conference chair, Craig Watkins, and the conference theme and Craig's talk will be Democratic Futures, Mobilizing Voices, and Remixing Youth Participation. So thanks again, everyone, and I hope to see you next week. Have a great day.